Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Tom. I work in H2's community engagement team, and I'll be hosting today's event for us. So this is actually the second in a series of Meet the Experts webinars that we've run, focusing on archaeological discoveries across the route. I'm going to do a very quick overview of the platform for you, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Rachel, who's going to talk to us about some of the work that H2 is doing in the Birmingham area. And then we'll hand over to John, who's our expert for the day, who'll give us a full update of the archaeological work that we've been doing at the Birmingham Curzon Street site, focusing specifically on the Roundhouse that was uncovered earlier this year. And then at the end of the session, we'll be doing a bit of a Q&A, so a text-based Q&A where you can pose your questions to us, and I'll hand over to our experts to answer them as best we can. So for the Q&A session, hopefully you'll all see on the right-hand side of your screen there'll be a little question mark symbol. If you click that, it will open up your Q&A panel, and that will allow you to pose a question to us. That will come through to us privately, so we will review the questions and then we'll collate them and we'll pose them to our speakers at the end of the session. As I say, we'll try and get through as many of these as we possibly can, but anything that we're not able to answer today, we'll take away and we'll aim to get an answer back to you as soon as we can after the event. So what I'll do, just to check that that's working and that you're all able to use the panel and the Q&A tool, I'm going to ask you to post an answer to a question for us. So let's do a quick test now. If you could just open up your Q&A panel, and on a scale of 1 to 5, let us know how much would you say you know about Birmingham's history. So enter 1 if you feel like you really don't know very much about Birmingham's history, all the way up to 5 if you'd consider yourself an expert in Birmingham's history. And that will just basically confirm to us that the Q&A panel is working and make sure that we can continue, and we're going to receive your questions. So I'll give you a second or so to fire some questions through, some answers to that. Okay, that's great. Yep, I can see quite a few questions coming through, quite a few answers coming through already, so that's good. So we know that the system's working, which is superb. And it seems like we've got a mix in the audience. We've got some people who say they know a little bit about Birmingham, quite a few of you saying you don't know a huge amount of Birmingham's history. No experts declared at the moment, but hopefully by the end of today's session you'll have learned a little bit more about what H2 is doing in Birmingham, and specifically about Birmingham's history. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to my colleague Rachel now, who's going to give you a very brief overview of our works in Birmingham.
Hi everybody, I'm Rachel. I'm a Senior Stakeholder and Engagement Manager at HS2, and I'm just going to kick off by explaining what the HS2 project is for anybody that is not aware. So HS2 is a brand new railway that will link up Britain, and the map that's on the screen now shows the planned route of the railway, which will basically be built in 2 phases. So the first phase is phase 1 from Birmingham to London, and then phase 2, which is from Birmingham to Manchester in the west and Birmingham to Leeds in the east. And the purpose of the railway is to release capacity on the existing rail network, rebalance the economy and provide a low carbon option for long distance travel. In central Birmingham, which is the focus of this webinar today, construction's well underway. So we are building a terminus station in the area of land between Moore Street Station and Millennium Point, which will be called Curzon Street Station. Curzon Street will have 7 platforms, run up to 9 trains per hour in each direction when it's fully operational, and the station footprint is around 32,000 square metres. LM, who are our enabling works contractor, have been on site since 2017, and they've been preparing the site for our main workstation contractor, who will be appointed early next year. The designs for Curzon Street Station, which you can see one of them on the screen now, was produced by WSP and Grimshaw Architects, and we recently received planning approval for the station from Birmingham City Council. The design seeks to maximise the benefit of natural resources such as sunlight and water, and it will have a number of new public spaces surrounding it. The design also incorporates the existing historic Old Curzon Street building, which you can just see on this slide on the left, and we'll link it to the new station's Eastern Concourse on New Canal Street. So I'm now going to hand over to John, who will be talking a little bit more about the Old Curzon Street building.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm John, one of the archaeologists working on the HS2 project. Before we get into Curzon Street and the exciting finds we've got there, I'll just give you a little bit of a background on archaeology and HS2. As it says on the screen here, it's the largest archaeological investigation programme ever undertaken in the UK. So it's a unique opportunity, really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for an archaeologist like myself to really retell the story of about 10,000 years British history. As you can see up there, number 1 on the list is Birmingham, because we've got so much exciting archaeology here. Hopefully this will allow you a little bit more of an insight into what we've got and what we're hoping to do with it, really. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now as you can see on the slide here, the archaeology of the historic railway lies immediately adjacent to our exciting new, terribly innovative station. And it's a wonderful juxtaposition from my point of view, because we've got innovation 1830 style next to innovation 21st century style. You know, you couldn't really have picked a better spot in Birmingham. Now, obviously, prior to the groundworks and the construction of our fabulous new railway terminus, we are undertaking a very detailed programme of heritage works. We've had 2 burial grounds, one of which had already been truncated in the Victorian period, and the probably much more widely known Park Street Gardens post-medieval burial ground that have had to be very sensitively dealt with prior to the construction, so that we can relocate the bodies with due care, dignity and respect. But today I'm going to mainly focus on rail heritage, because otherwise I'll be wittering on for far too long. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the Old Curzon Street station, or rightly speaking, just Curzon Street station at the moment, because we haven't got the new one yet. It's one of the very few survivals of this very early phase of mainline railway building. It was designed in the 1830s by a chap called Philip Hardwick, who went on to actually be one of the first presidents of the Royal Institute for Buildings Architects. So he's a very well-known chap, and it was really designed as the counterpoint to the probably more widely known Euston Arch, which was sadly demolished in the 1960s. Luckily for us, this one survived demolition in the 1970s. We've got all sorts of exciting things going on with the building, which we'll touch on in a moment. But this was actually not ever designed as a station building in the true sense. This was meant to be the boardroom and the general offices of the London and Birmingham Railway. The amusing thing is that within a year it had been converted to a refreshments room, and the board had never actually met in there because they preferred the wine list at Dee's Royal Hotel in the centre of town. It was extended into a formal hotel. We think it's probably the first purpose-built railway hotel in the world in 1841. And basically it operated as a goods station office from 1854 to 1966. A refurbishment was undertaken in the 1980s. Sadly, from our point of view, it wasn't desperately sympathetic, but I would acknowledge that it did save the building for us to enjoy at the present time, although in a rather modified state, because as you can probably see in that old photograph on the right-hand side of your screens, the 1841 extension was demolished, which is a bit of a shame, because it looked to be quite an interesting building, and it would probably answer quite a few questions about how the building worked as a hotel, which we've just never really managed to grasp. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this slide actually shows the London and Birmingham Railway Station building as it was in 1838. You can see it's got 2 little flanking arches, beautiful railings. You can actually see the ticket office in the background, and strangely, perhaps to modern understanding, a row of houses. It turns out basically there were land disputes and the owner refused to sell the houses, so they were there for a good 10 or 15 years before the railway managed to convince them to sell up. Now, the wonderful thing here is that we're hoping to bring this building back to life, and HS2 are working towards a full refurbishment of this wonderful building, with a cafe and exhibition space on the ground floor, So you'll be able to actually meet someone, COVID-19 restrictions permitting, of course, to actually answer questions face to face about HS2 and what we're up to. The first floor will be Birmingham City University's STEAM House project, which is young enterprise and startup business space. So that's great. That drives forward Birmingham's reputation as a capital of industry. And then on the second floor, we've actually got Historic England's regional office for the Midlands moving in. So it's wonderful to see this building coming back to gainful use after a period of some neglect. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, most people probably aren't aware there actually were 2 railways built at Curzon Street, not just the London-Birmingham Railway, which we all know about. There was also the Grand Junction Railway. A little bit of this wall survives in a rather poor state now along the south side of Curzon Street. And the Grand Junction Railway actually got to Birmingham first. It only got as far as Duddeston in 1837. It didn't reach Curzon Street until 1839, by which point the London and Birmingham Railway had nicked all of the prime real estate, and they were constrained to this very strange triangular space at the back of the site, which caused all sorts of problems with their station design. But there it is. They, yep, next slide, sorry. Yep. So, London and Birmingham Railway. Apologies, I don't have many old photos, so I've had to use the same one. Basically, this opened to passengers in 1838, and the station complex didn't just include the building we know and love today. It also included platforms, although they were actually much lower than we would expect, because they hadn't worked out how to build stations quite to ease it for passengers at the time. And the trains were much like Stephenson's Rocket, although they were built in Bury, and they looked like stagecoaches in terms of their coaches rather than what we'd expect today. The roof of the platforms was a unique invention, which actually gained more exciting press coverage at the time because of its innovation, because it was iron framed, than any other aspect actually on the station complex. We've uncovered extensive remains of various bits and pieces to do with both of these railways in the area. And obviously we've also got the ticket office that we've uncovered parts of, as well as the Roundhouse, which we'll come on to later in a bit more detail. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the London and Birmingham Railway and the Grand Junction Railway had agreed from day one that they would allow through routes, basically. So passengers from one could get through the boundary to the other platforms without any difficulty. They'd actually built a doorway in. So even though they were rivals, they realised that there was a market for people wanting to travel from Liverpool and Manchester via Birmingham to London. It made sense for trade and general business. Now, by 1846, this had got to the point that they merged and created the London and North West Railway. Now, the London and North Western quickly realised that Curzon Street at that time was not close enough to the centre of the city, and that a new station was needed. And they'd got enough money and confidence by this point to be willing to pay to build the tunnel that was needed to get into New Street. This was completed by 1854, and Curzon Street began its life as a goods station, which, as you can see on the screen, was a very large-scale operation in the fullness of time. This is a photo from the 1950s, and as you can see, it involves huge numbers of lines, lots of sheds and warehouses. You can see the old Curzon Street building poking up at the background, and that was used as the goods station office up until 1966, when this complex shut. Okay, next slide, please. And this drone footage that you can see now is the remains of the Grand Junction Railway and the later goods station yard. As you can see, we've got remains of platforms, offices in cellars, turntables. We've even got a stretch of the boundary wall between the London and Birmingham Railway and the Grand Junction Railway. It's really very exciting. Okay, and onto the Roundhouse. Now, the Roundhouse, we did expect to discover this. It's not a surprise to us. We knew it was there, and we'd been long planning this program of works. However, when we did start to uncover them, the remains turned out to be much better preserved than we'd expected. As you can see in front of you, it is round, as you'd expect, but it's not exclusively round. And we've got the full footprint of everything as it was intended in the 1830s, plus some later extensions, which we'll discuss in a bit more detail. The photographs on the right give you some indication of the depth of the remains as well. You know, we're talking probably 2 or 3 meters below ground, with brickwork surviving. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in front of you, you've got one of the 1837 architect's drawings. It was designed by Robert Stevenson in 1837, and it actually came into operation in November of 1837, which is about 2 years before the Roundhouse in Derby, which had been previously thought to be the earliest in the world. So we're really excited that, as far as we can tell through our research, it is the first of its type ever built. It was extended in 1842, and contemporary accounts detail a 300-foot long coke vault for locomotive fuel storage. We think we've located that, but work's still ongoing. And it's really quite incredible to see how accurately all of this actually maps onto the remains we've got. The details that are shown in front of you marry up to, I think it's about 4 inches in terms of what we've actually got once we've surveyed it in the field. It was extended again before 1854, when the London and North Western Railway realised they needed even more locomotive shed space. And there was a problem that, because railways were advancing at such a pace at this period, the old sheds like this one started to become obsolete very, very rapidly, because the locomotives were simply too big to fit in them. Sadly, it was demolished in 1860 without ever having really been looked after or appreciated particularly. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is photogrammetry, which overlays what we've recovered to date over the original survey drawings, and as you can see, they match basically perfectly. It's really been quite remarkable. I don't think I could say I've ever seen an archaeological site where we've had such absolute clarity over the intention and then the execution of a plan. As you can see, it survives incredibly well. We've got 16 roads, which is the sort of parking spaces, if you will, for the locomotives around a central turntable. We know from the archival records that originally it was basically like a large ring donut with a funnel-shaped entry building at the northwest, and a pumping station below ground with a steam engine in the cellar and a massive water tank on the roof. So it's quite a remarkable find, and we still don't entirely understand how some of this works, because those details have been lost through the passage of time. As you can see, the strange thing here is it's only 124 feet across, and that was big enough at the time for 16 locomotives and tenders, or 32 locomotives on their own. So it gives you some real impression when you think about the size of a modern train, about how small this structure actually is. And that's one of the reasons it was swept away in 1860, because basically it was obsolete and it was in the way by that point. So I think this probably is the best shot, giving you the indication. You've got the 1840s, 50s shed at the left of that screen where it was extended, and then you've got just at the top right of that last image where the coke vault is thought to be. Okay, now we've got a 3D model which will give you a slice through the roundhouse. As you can see, this is why we collect so much survey data, because basically if you look at it in plan, it gives you some information. Once you start looking at it in 3D, it really gives you some idea of the level of preservation, and we can start to really understand the different levels and complexities of the structure. And to give you some indication of scale, the turntable pit in the middle, that round wall, is above knee height on someone who's about 6 foot tall. So you're probably talking about 2.5 meters above ground level there. And then the remains of the funnel-shaped building that's in the background there are probably 2.5 or 3 meters deep. So it's proving a little bit of a logistical challenge to dig some of this safely as well. But luckily our contractors are up to the job.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for that. That was really helpful overview of the works that we've been undertaking there, specifically some of the finds there, and I hope that the audience has found that interesting and useful. And it's fascinating to see some of that new drone footage and some of the uses that we get from that, I suppose, from undertaking this work. What we're going to do now, we're going to run through some of the questions that you've been posing throughout the session. So if you do have any questions you wanted to ask throughout, please feel free to fire them into the questions panel now, and we'll pick up a few of those. I think a couple of them have been published already. But I'll introduce you to our panelists who are going to answer the questions. So obviously we've got John, who's our historic environment manager there, who focuses on the works in Birmingham. We've got Rachel, who's our engagement manager, also in the Birmingham and West Midlands area. And then we've got Mike, who's our lead archaeologist on the HS2 programme, and Helen, who's our head of heritage, also joining us. So we've got a team of people who hopefully can cover the questions that you're posing to us at the moment. Obviously, they're mainly focused on archaeology, so if they're very knowledgeable on their subject, but if we've got questions that we receive outside of that, we'll either, if we think we can answer them, we'll answer them now. If not, we'll take them offline with you and try and get an answer to you as soon as we can. And as I say, we've had a few questions that have come through already. There's quite a few that are coming through that we haven't published yet, which we get asked a lot. And I'll pass this one over to Helen to start with, which is lots of people asking, as they always do, what do we do with all of the finds that we're uncovering through the archaeological work? So Helen, if I can ask you to take this one for us.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So a lot of analysis will continue now that the team is largely out the field, as it were. So make sure that they get all the scientific and documentary information out about the site so that it can continue to tell the story that John's just highlighted to us. And then, of course, we will be working with local museums to deposit the artefacts and records, both with local museum providers and also the digital record with the Archaeology Data Service. So there will be a lot of information coming forward. We'll be disseminating books, lectures will continue, there'll be community events, but at the end of everything, deposition with a local museum.
Superb, thank you, Helen. Right, let's go back to our Q&A panel then. So as you can see, you probably all see we've published a few of the questions that have been asked so far. So the first one, I think I'll pose this one for you, John, actually. There's one of the questions we had was around some of the brickwork that was uncovered and then dug up and removed, and there was a question about whether it was possible, was it not possible to leave that in place? I don't know if you're able to answer that for us.
Okay, well, that's an ongoing discussion, actually. We're currently engaging with key stakeholders, as well as our design team and the City Council, about how we go about mitigating any impacts, but also looking at preserving in the best possible way this significant find. So we are exploring all opportunities at the moment. So watch this space.
Thank you. Another one for you, John. This one: when Curzon Street Station turns to a goods station, did the new station they build become Grand Central?
Yes, Grand Central Station, or New Street Station as we commonly call it these days, was the new plan. The difficulty we had was that in the early days of railway, it was speculative expenditure on behalf of shareholders, so people were very reticent to do anything that was high risk or high cost, and building a tunnel under significantly populated areas of central Birmingham just wasn't considered expedient in the 1830s. By the 1840s and 50s, it was clear railways weren't a newfangled fad. They were something that was here to stay and that was profitable, so they were willing to actually take the risk and put their hands in their pockets, basically.
Superb. Thank you very much. Another question coming through from an anonymous member of the audience. Are there any plans to incorporate the Roundhouse Sites into the design of the new station?
Okay, I think, as I sort of alluded to earlier, that's ongoing. Those discussions are in depth. It's not a quick process, but we're certainly exploring what we can do.
Superb. I've got a question, probably Rachel, you might be the best one to answer this one actually. It's a question from Ian in the audience, who asks, are there any plans for organised access to the sites to see it firsthand? So obviously at the moment that's going to be very complicated with everything that's going on in the world. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about potential site visits in future.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that we were hoping to do, actually, especially given the discovery of the Roundhouse. We'd hoped to that this might have been an event that we could have taken people on site to actually, in organised groups, to kind of have a look. Obviously, with the ongoing COVID-19 situation, we're just not sure when it's going to be safe to bring people onto site in groups. It's something in the long term that we would like to do, and we've always looked at the potential for having viewing areas on sites and things like that. So it's kind of we have to see really what happens with the current situation and when that will be safe, but it is an aspiration that we have, that we'll be able to do something like that in the future.
Thanks. And yeah, it's probably worth saying even beyond the being able to see the Roundhouse itself, obviously the intention throughout the build of this railway is to try and involve the communities and public as much as possible. So there will hopefully be opportunities for us to bring people onto sites. Obviously that has to be done in a very safe and organised way, and the best way probably to stay informed about those kind of opportunities will be by following our community websites or our social media channels, where we'll advertise those types of events. Let's see. A question from Kevin here. What further archaeology studies are you planning to do on the Roundhouse, and when finished, what will happen to the Roundhouse? So I think John's already covered the intentions around what will happen to the Roundhouse itself, but is there any further work, John, that's being undertaken at the moment and in the near future?
Well, phase one of the archaeology there is actually completed now, but we are moving on to a second phase, because we've still identified some areas where we just don't quite have the right answers. We just need a bit more data. So at the moment, I can say we've got some specialist surveyors on site using ground penetrating radar. So we're trying to define the extent of things like the coke vault, because, as I say, it's a huge challenge both archaeologically and engineering wise to make sure that we make informed decisions about the future of any of the structures on this site. And we need to make sure that stage one on this is that we've got all the data to inform that decision-making process. So the ground penetrating radar survey is being undertaken now, so we can identify any voids, but also so that we can identify the actual extent and survival of any of this extra structure, hopefully. And then that will likely lead to further targeted archaeological investigation over the remains of the sort of ancillary structures, as it were, to the Roundhouse.
Excellent, thank you very much. A question here from John. So is this scientific work and the uncovering factored into the overall station programme? Do the archaeologists have a limited period of time to carry out their work to prevent delay for the new station build? So this is a question that we get asked a lot, and most major infrastructure projects or construction projects get asked the same question. Do the finds that we uncover affect the overall delivery schedule for the railway or the station in Birmingham? Helen, it might be best for you to take that one, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Well, just to give people an indication as to how long we've actually been researching the project, I've this last month just completed 8 years on the project, and so there's a whole team of us, Mike included. He's been with us 7 years. We've been on the project a very long time to work with the design, so we're very much part of the programme. And so the work that John is overseeing is built into the programme. So it's built into the overall Enabling Works programme to make sure that we have decided what we want to do, where we want to do it, and then worked out how long we're actually going to need to do that work. So we're very much part of the project. We're not at all an afterthought. And so it's all programmed. It's like the ecology works or the utility diversion works. Everything has to be synchronized in. We're part of a very, very big and complex team, but we're very much programmed into that workspace so that we have the time that we need to do the work on site.
Superb, thank you very much. John, I'm going to come back to you. There's a very specific question about one of the buildings in one of the first picture slides. It says there was a building with a bullnose shape near to the old station. We have a similar building in York. Do you know what your building was, who the architect was, and if it's still there? So this will test your knowledge.
Okay, interesting. I'm trying to think of which slide. The only bullnose building I can think of is actually probably the hotel extension. As I say, 1841. Can't remember the architect off the top of my head, but I know that some of the drawings were actually pulled together by William Dockeray, who was lead engineer for the railway company by that point.
Okay, superb. What it might be worth doing, so that question was posed by someone anonymously, so it might be worth, if you are able, we'll reply within the chat window after this to you, but you could also pose that to our help desk team, and we'll make sure that that question gets to John, and he will take the time to research that for you. There's a question from Julian here. So it says, also for you, John, so we'll stay with you for now. Were you aware that goods use of Curzon Street didn't cease in 1966? A large parcels concentration depot was built on the site, serving a large area of the West Midlands. Around a dozen parcels trains a day, each with 10 to 12 vehicles, arrived. The parcels were sorted into delivery rounds and loaded into vans. Some outbound parcels traffic was also handled. This activity ceased in the early to mid 1980s. So obviously somebody who has, by the sound of things, a very good knowledge of the area. I think the question is, were you aware of that, John, I guess, or were we aware of that?
Yes, we were. Thanks. Yeah, basically, we actually found the remains of the railway parcel. We knew they were post goods station, and they were the parcel force depot, as it was lovingly known prior to the demolition.
Cool. Okay, so there's a few other similar questions about what will happen to the roundhouse itself, which I think you've already covered, John. Obviously, those discussions are ongoing, as John said, but the intention has always been for it to be reflected in the final design of the station. The question from Colin: what type of artifacts have been found? So I suppose beyond the physical remains of the building, John, are there any sort of standout finds that that your team has uncovered that you're aware of or a fan of?
Yeah, it's a slightly strange site in some ways, because I should make it clear that in 1860 they didn't just demolish the building. The demolition contractors were making a profit on salvaging as much of the material as they could. So a lot of the artifactual evidence that you'd sort of hoped for, like pieces of window or roof structure or anything, that was carted off very carefully so they could maximise their profit. That said, we have found elsewhere on the site some fairly odd things, including the remains of a bronze capstan, because even into the 1960s, the goods station was actually using man-pulled ropes around capstans to move some of the wagons around. They were still using 1830s, 40s and 50s turntables that were manually operated, again using ropes and capstans. We did actually find during the GI some bits of rope, which was a bit of a surprise, and we're not quite sure why, but in the area of the goods station that was formerly the copper and smelter yard, we did find a load of copper smelting waste, including crucibles. We still haven't really bottomed out whether that's just an incidental dump where they've been making up levels to put a new floor in or something, or whether it actually does mean that they were in effect reprocessing metal on the site before shipping it out.
Superb, thank you very much. Question here from Carl that says, at what stage is the development now, i.e. are we in the groundworks, earthwork stage? So I'll start that, and then I'll maybe turn to Rachel, who's our local expert. But so as sort of Rachel mentioned earlier, we've been in the enabling works phase for about 3 years now, 2.5 to 3 years, which has involved archaeology, utility diversions, clearing the site, some of the buildings that existed and some of the grounds to prepare for building the main station. And we are, as you may have seen, just in April this year, the government gave approval for our main works contractors to mobilise. So we're very much still in the enabling works phase, but we're right on the cusp of moving into main civil works construction. Rachel, did you want to add anything more to that?
Yeah, just for the main works around Curzon Street, as Tom's alluded to. So on the actual site, it's ground remediation at the moment, and then around the site we're doing a lot of utilities work. So there is utility surveys, and then moving the utilities around to for the new station. And it's slightly complicated in the stations area because there'll be a station contractor that will deliver the main works, the build of the station there, that has not been appointed yet, and they'll be appointed early next year. And then we've got Balfour Beatty Vinci, who are our main works contractor, who will deliver the viaducts that basically lead into the station. So you'll start to see that work starting a little bit earlier. But again, as Tom said earlier, for any kind of detailed work information, we have all that information on our HS2 in Birmingham website. So that gives you the kind of notifications of what's going on, a little bit of detail about what's going on. So that's a good place to look for any future information.
Great, thanks. Rachel, so let's see, we've got a few more questions here. There's had some great questions come through, so thank you very much for everybody for not just signing up but also joining us today and for posing the questions. It's really good, and it's the purpose of these sessions really to try and create a nice engaging conversation and be able to share information with you, which we would normally do face to face. So it's a nice exercise for us to run through. So there's a couple more questions here. Let's see. So, did the teams, a question from one of the members of the audience, did the teams encounter any unplanned challenges or surprises during the excavation of this project? It's probably one for John, I suppose, as some of the work that's been undertaken on site so far as our archaeology expert. Has there been anything surprising or unexpected that the team's uncovered?
Not in relation to the railway material that we've uncovered. We had a pretty solid plan, and to be honest, we've been very fortunate. Our contractors are excellent, and they've followed through like clockwork. The biggest challenge actually is the 10 or 11,000 year old peat deposits that were identified under part of the railway site, and that involved digging a trench to a depth of about 7.5 meters. That was just a logistical challenge. The works have gone off without a hitch, but that wasn't necessarily something that had been planned from day one. That only came to light during more recent GI work.
Okay, super. And I'll stick with you, John. There's a question from Chris here who asks, after the goods station closed in the 60s, there was a big parcels depot on the Curzon Street site. Did its construction impact on the earlier buildings that survived? And is there anything significant remaining from that phase of the site's life?
Okay, in terms of impact, yes, in a nutshell. There are large blocks of concrete for the footings that have been chopped through sections of the London and Birmingham Railway in particular, because that's where the main shed was. That said, it hasn't impacted significantly on the earlier phases of the archaeology on the site, because when we've trenched the area and when we've monitored the area, we have actually uncovered pretty much what we were expecting. I mean, we're very fortunate that the area was well mapped, and the records have been kept very well by the National Rail Museum.
Superb. Okay, there's a question here asking about how many people worked on the site when it was in full operation. So I guess that's the London to Birmingham Railway that they're asking about, or the heritage railways. Do we know that, John?
Sorry. Yes, basically during the operation of the railway itself, I wouldn't be able to hazard a guess, but hundreds. I mean, I've seen site photographs, and it was a very, very busy place. In terms of the archaeologists, we've had a team of about 30 people on there. Though obviously, due to COVID restrictions, that was having to be reduced because of self-isolation and making sure that we could keep social distancing.
Superb. And then we've got a question from Sandy, who says Millennium Point was built on the old goods yard, which would have been connected to Curzon Street Station. Has the archaeological evidence from that available, and how will this be linked to the Roundhouse excavation?
Okay, that's to be decided exactly how we link it up. It certainly will be considered going forwards. We were aware of the work, and we are liaising with people who are actually involved with the excavation and recording those buildings and below ground archaeology on that site.
Okay, superb. Thank you. Cool. There's a couple more questions. So I think we've tried to cover as many as we can here to try and make this as helpful for you as possible. But as I say, if we're not able to answer everything, we'll do our best to come back to you after the event and get some more detail on it. So there's a couple of questions that I'll pick up, and then we'll move on to closing the conversation out, I suppose. So a question from Colin. So we'll stick with you, John, for now as our resident expert in the area's history. Was the area bombed in World War II, and are there any signs of UXBs?
Okay, we haven't found any unexploded ordnance on the site, and I would highlight that HS2, being conscious of the risk along our route, had actually commissioned specialists to undertake a survey of this before we break ground anywhere. Yes, in a nutshell, the area was blitzed in 1940 and 41, and Old Curzon Street itself bears witness to that. It was hit by a German oil bomb, which took out most of the roof, and I suspect the reason that there's a couple of slightly odd-looking wrought iron beams secured to the walls internally is because the building was a bit shaky. All of the windows are post-war as well, for the same reason. Basically, it blasted all the glass out, took out more than half the roof. We're very lucky, really, that the building survived. I'm not quite sure how it stayed up.
Superb, thanks, John. And then there's a couple of other questions, so which probably easiest for me to take, actually. One of them was a member of the audience asking if it's possible for them to take photos of the site itself. So, I mean, as Rachel mentioned earlier, obviously we had intended to be able to bring people onto site to see this find, because it is of major significance, major importance, not just for Birmingham's history, but for railway history in general. But obviously with COVID-19, that's been difficult. In general, we try and document the site as much as we possibly can ourselves. So our contractors and our teams here are taking photos of all of our work sites to try and keep a visual record of it. But I think probably the opportunity for photography of the site on a personal level, I guess, will probably be at the points in time when we're able to bring people back onto site to have a look. So at the moment, we don't know. The answer is probably no, you can't get down there at the moment, but we'll certainly try and make some opportunities available for the public to come down and have a look. And obviously, for any of those sessions, we would encourage people to take photos and a record of their visit to remember it. And then a final question which came through was asking for a list of the websites that Rachel had mentioned earlier. So it's probably easiest if I move on to the next slide for this one. And just to say that, as Rachel said, we've got a host of community websites that we've set up along the line of route, which are designed to provide information at a local level. Obviously, HS2 is a huge railway, and it covers large parts of the country. But we've broken it down. I think we've got 14 different sites that break down the route into geographic areas that are probably more familiar to you. So if you visit h2inyourarea.co.uk, you can see a list of all of those sites. And if you subscribe to them, you'll get notifications about works that are being planned or taking place in the area. You get information about community engagement events like the ones that we're running today in some respects, our online events, as well as our traditional events when we get back into business as usual. And it's obviously got points of contact for your local engagement team and the HS2 help desk team as well, if you do have any questions that you want to pose to the project. So that's the best place for you. In addition to that, our social media channels there are listed, so if you do want to follow those, that keeps you up to date with progress across the line of routes. And really, I think it's probably at this point that just to say again, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you found the conversation useful and informative. Hopefully you've learned something about Birmingham's history. This is, as I said, the second in a series of webinars that we've run. We're planning to do some further sessions on other areas of the route, focusing on the archaeological discoveries. But really, we need your feedback to help us improve these events. We've set up a link here, which I think will be posted in the Q&A panel shortly by one of my colleagues. So you can, it would be really great if you can take the time out of your day to fill in some feedback, let us know how you found the event, and help us to improve them. We're planning to do these regularly throughout the year and throughout the delivery of the project. So your feedback is really helpful, and it helps us to make sure that we're providing information that you need. So at that point, I'll close this webinar. So thanks very much to all of our panelists who joined us today, and thank you very much in particular to the audience who have tuned in. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and we look forward to you joining us at one of our future events. Thanks very much. Take care.